I am Hazel Reed, 32, and I stood alone in my mother's hospital room, staring at the empty bed where she had taken her final breath just hours ago. My family, my father, brother, and sister, were nowhere to be found. They had abandoned her during her greatest time of need. As I gathered her few belongings, I discovered a sealed envelope under her pillow with my name written in her shaky handwriting. What I read in that letter would change my entire perception of my family forever. In my hands, I held the truth about a 30-year betrayal and a hidden fortune that would set me on a path of revenge I never thought I was capable of. Before I dive into this painful story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments, hit that like button if you've ever discovered a shocking family secret, and subscribe to join our community of real-life storytellers. Trust me, you'll want to stick around to see how I turned my mother's final gift into the justice she deserved. Growing up, I believed we were the picture-perfect American family. We lived in a beautiful colonial-style home, in a pristine Massachusetts suburb. My father, Richard, was a respected financial advisor. My brother, Tyler, was the high school quarterback with a full scholarship to Stanford, and my sister, Morgan, was the perpetually perky cheerleader who seemed to have the kindest heart. My mother, Elaine, was the glue that held us all together, baking cookies for school events, volunteering at the local hospital, and somehow always managing to attend every one of our recitals and games despite her busy schedule. Then there was me, the odd one out. I wasn't athletic like Tyler or effortlessly charming like Morgan. I was quiet, bookish, and far more interested in numbers than social climbing. My father would often joke that I must have been switched at birth because I didn't possess the classic Reed family charisma. The joke always stung, but my mother would quickly come to my defense, saying I had depth the others lacked. Hazel sees the world differently, she would say, squeezing my hand. And that's her superpower. What I couldn't see then was how my father's jokes masked genuine contempt, how my brother's playful shoves contained real malice, and how my sister's sweet smile often concealed calculation. I was blind to the truth about my family until 8 months ago, when my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis came suddenly. Mom had been complaining about back pain for months, but our family doctor, a golfing buddy of my father's, kept insisting it was just stress. By the time she got a second opinion, the cancer had metastasized. The prognosis was grim. 6 to 8 months, at most. At first, everyone rallied around her. Dad took time off work, Tyler flew home from California, and Morgan organized a meal train. The house filled with flowers and casseroles, but as weeks turned into months and Mom didn't get better, how could she? Their dedication wavered. The first sign came 3 months in, when I overheard my father on the phone with his brother, my Uncle Bennett. "This is taking longer than expected," he whispered from his study. "The accounts are ready, but we need to wait until—" "Yes, I know. The sooner the better." I thought he was talking about some financial arrangement to help with Mom's care, maybe setting up a trust. I was grateful for his planning, especially since I had quit my position at an accounting firm to become Mom's full-time caregiver. Then came the first true betrayal. 5 months into Mom's illness, when she was having good days and bad days but still very much with us, my father announced a family vacation to the Bahamas. "We all need a break," he declared over dinner. "A chance to recharge." "But what about Mom?" I asked, stunned. "She can't travel." "Your mother understands," he said, not even looking at her. "The nurse can stay with her for the week." I turned to Mom, expecting her to object, but she just sat there, a strange expression on her face, not hurt, as I expected, but something harder, something I'd never seen before. "You go," she said quietly. "Hazel will stay with me." My siblings didn't even put up a token argument. Tyler talked about how he deserved a break from all this depressing stuff. And Morgan claimed she had already bought new swimsuits. The betrayal cut deep, not just for me, but I thought for Mom too. That night, I confronted my family in the kitchen after Mom had gone to bed. "How can you just leave her?" "She's dying," I hissed. "Don't be so dramatic, Hazel," Morgan said, rolling her eyes. "Mom wants us to enjoy life." "Yeah, stop trying to guilt-trip everyone," Tyler added. "Just because you don't have a life doesn't mean the rest of us should put ours on hold." My father simply stated, "This discussion is over," and walked away. That night marked a turning point. I saw my family clearly for the first time, their selfishness, their callousness, but I still didn't understand the full picture. I didn't know that their abandonment wasn't just emotional cruelty, it was part of a calculated plan that had been in motion for decades. I just knew that as they packed their bags for white sand beaches, I sat beside my mother's bed, holding her increasingly frail hand, wondering how the people who were supposed to love her most could simply walk away when she needed them most. The hospital room where my mother spent her final days was clinical and sterile, despite my attempts to make it homier with photos and her favorite lavender-scented pillow. The rhythmic beeping of monitors became the soundtrack to our dwindling time together. Each day, I would arrive early in the morning and leave only when the night nurses gently suggested I get some rest. My family, however, had essentially disappeared. "Did your father call today?" Mom would sometimes ask, her voice weaker by the day. "Hess in meetings, but he sends his love." I would lie, not wanting her to know that he rarely even answered my calls anymore. The truth was far uglier. Dad had stopped visiting 2 weeks earlier, claiming the hospital depressed him. Tyler had returned to California, saying he had training he couldn't miss. Morgan showed up occasionally, but spent most of her visits scrolling through her phone in the corner of the room, leaving after 20 minutes with excuses about important appointments. 3 days before Mom died, I made desperate calls to everyone. The doctors had made it clear the end was imminent. "Dad, the doctors say it's time. You need to come now." I pleaded into the phone. "I have clients, Hazel," he replied, irritation clear in his voice. "I'll try to swing by tomorrow." Tyler was worse. "Can't you just FaceTime me when it's actually happening? I can't keep flying back and forth for false alarms." Morgan at least pretended to care. "Oh my God, that's terrible. I'm actually at this charity thing right now, but it'll definitely come first thing tomorrow. Give Mom a kiss for me." None of them came the next day, or the day after. On her final night, Mom was unusually lucid. The pain medication that usually kept her drowsy had been adjusted, and for a few precious hours, she was almost her old self again. "Hazel," she whispered, motioning me closer to her bed. "You need to listen carefully." "I'm listening, Mom," I said, holding her hand between mine, alarmed by how cold her fingers felt. "There are documents in the house, behind the painting in my bedroom." Her breathing was labored, each word a struggle. "You need to find them. The truth. About everything." "What documents, Mom?" "What truth?" I asked, confused and scared. She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll look. Promise me you won't let them take everything." "I promise," I said automatically, thinking this was just confusion from the medication. "But who?" "Take what?" Her eyes, sunken in her pale face, suddenly burned with intensity. "Your father. Bennett. They've been stealing from me for years. From you." Before I could ask more, she started coughing, and then drifted back to sleep. I sat there, bewildered, telling myself it was just the medication talking. My father had always handled our family finances. That was normal, wasn't it? The next morning, at 5:47 a.m., my mother took her last breath. I was holding her hand, telling her about the cardinals I had seen outside her window, her favorite birds. There was no Hollywood moment, no profound last words, just a slight pressure on my fingers, a shuddering exhale, and then stillness. I sat there for a long time, numb with grief, before finally calling the nurse. Then I called my father. "She's gone," I said when he answered, my voice hollow. There was a pause, and then, "I'll call Bennett. Well, be there in a few hours." Not "I'm sorry," not "are you okay," just the cold logistics of death. True to his word, my father arrived at the hospital 4 hours later with my Uncle Bennett, not my siblings. They walked into the room where I had been sitting vigil beside my mother's body, and the first words out of my father's mouth were, "Have they taken her to the morgue yet? We need to get the death certificate processed for the insurance." I stared at him, unable to comprehend the callousness. Bennett, always the more tactical of the brothers, at least had the decency to offer me an awkward pat on the shoulder before pulling out his phone. "I've already contacted Calvin," he said to my father, referring to our family lawyer. "Hess preparing the paperwork. We can meet at his office tomorrow." They spoke as if I wasn't there, discussing assets and transfers while standing feet away from my mother's body. I sat in stunned silence until the hospital staff came to take her away. As I gathered Mom's few belongings, her hairbrush, a worn paperback novel, her wedding ring they had removed, I felt something under her pillow, a sealed envelope with my name written on it in her handwriting. I quickly slipped it into my purse before my father or uncle could see it. Tyler and Morgan arrived just as we were leaving the hospital, perfectly timed to avoid seeing their mother's body but early enough to be counted as present on the day she died. Morgan had the audacity to be wearing designer sunglasses and carrying a Starbucks cup. "Oh, Hazel, you look awful," she said, as if my disheveled appearance after watching our mother die was some kind of social faux pas. "You should go home and shower before the funeral home meeting." I couldn't even respond. In that moment, looking at my family all well-dressed, composed, and utterly unmoved by the loss of the woman who had given them everything, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. "Calvin wants to talk about the will tomorrow," my father said to the group as we walked to the parking lot. 10 o'clock at his office. That was when I remembered Mom's strange words from the night before. The documents, the truth, the envelope burning a hole in my purse. I mumbled something about needing time alone and rushed to my car. I couldn't open that envelope in front of them. Something told me that whatever was inside would change everything, and I wasn't wrong. The hospital chapel was empty when I slipped inside, clutching my purse to my chest. The stained glass windows cast colorful shadows across the simple wooden pews, and the silence enveloped me like a blanket. This was as good a place as any to read my mother's final words. My hands trembled as I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written in my mother's elegant handwriting, stronger and steadier than it had been in her final days. She must have written this before the cancer had weakened her too severely. "My dearest Hazel," it began. "If you're reading this, I have passed on, and you are alone in your grief. For that, I am deeply sorry. What I'm about to tell you will cause you more pain, and if there were any other way, I would spare you this burden. But you deserve the truth, and you are the only one I trust to set things right." I took a deep breath and continued reading. I was not always Elaine Reed, devoted wife and mother from a modest background. Before I met your father, I was Elaine Montgomery, sole heiress to the Montgomery publishing fortune. My parents died when I was 22, leaving me with assets worth over $30 million. I nearly dropped the letter in shock. My mother, an heiress? We had always lived comfortably, but certainly not in the manner of a family with that kind of wealth. Our house was nice but not extravagant. I attended public schools. We took modest vacations. Nothing in our lifestyle suggested hidden millions. I met Richard at a charity gala, the letter continued. He was charming, attentive, and seemingly uninterested in my money, a refreshing change from the fortune hunters I'd become accustomed to. Within 6 months, we were married. I was young, naive, and desperately in love. Early in our marriage, Richard suggested his brother Bennett help manage my inheritance. Bennett had impressive credentials and spoke convincingly about investment strategies that would grow my assets while allowing us to live simply, away from the spotlight of wealth that had made me so uncomfortable growing up. I agreed, signing papers that gave them both partial control over various accounts and holdings. It wasn't until last year, 30 years into our marriage, that I discovered the truth. They had been systematically stealing from me for decades, moving money into offshore accounts, creating fake investment losses, and forging my signature on documents that transferred ownership of my family's properties. What they couldn't steal outright, they borrowed against, leaving hollow shells where there should have been millions. I confronted Richard privately last November. Instead of shame or denial, he was smug, almost proud of how they had outsmarted me all these years. He told me there was nothing I could do. The paper trail was too complex, the transactions too old, and my signature, forged or coerced, was on everything. He reminded me that I had been too delicate and artistic to bother with financial matters, too trusting to question their management. The worst betrayal came next. He revealed that Tyler and Morgan have known about this scheme since they were in college. They each receive regular payments from these hidden accounts in exchange for their silence and complicity. They are not innocent bystanders, Hazel. They are willing participants in the theft of your inheritance as much as mine. Tears stream down my face as I read those words. The family vacation during Mom's illness, their absence during her final days, it wasn't just callousness. It was calculation. They had been waiting for her to die, knowing that with her death, the final obstacle to their complete control of her fortune would be removed. You are wondering, I'm sure, why I never told you. Mom's letter continued. At first, I was gathering evidence. I hired a private investigator who has documented everything: the forged signatures, the fraudulent accounts, the paper trail of theft that spans 3 decades. Then, when I received my cancer diagnosis, I realized I was running out of time. I needed to protect you. If I had told you while I was alive, They would have seen you as a threat too. Richard has always resented your closeness to me, your independence. I feared what he might do if he knew you were aware of their crimes. So I waited and prepared. In our family home, behind the painting of the lighthouse in my bedroom, is a hidden wall safe. The combination is your birthday, the 21st of March 2089. Inside, you will find everything you need: bank statements, property deeds, recordings of conversations, and my investigator's complete file. Also inside is contact information for a lawyer who specializes in financial fraud. He is expecting your call. This evidence is your shield and your sword, Hazel. Use it wisely. The fortune they stole wasn't just mine, it was meant to be yours too. Fight for what is rightfully ours. Fight for justice. I am so sorry to leave you with this burden, but I know your strength. You have always seen more clearly than the others, felt more deeply. That wasn't weakness, as your father claimed. It was integrity. I love you, my darling girl. You were always my greatest joy. Forever, Mom. I sat in that chapel for a long time, the letter clutched in my hands, my mind reeling from revelations that transformed my entire understanding of my family and my life. The grief of losing my mother was now compounded by the knowledge of decades of betrayal. But something else was rising within me too. Beneath the shock and sorrow, I felt a cold, clarifying anger. My mother had been systematically robbed by the people who should have protected her. She had suffered in silence, fighting a battle on two fronts: against cancer and against her own family's treachery. She had entrusted me with the truth, and with the means to seek justice. I would not let her down. As I carefully folded the letter and returned it to my purse, I made a silent vow. This wasn't just about money, though. The thought of my father and siblings living luxuriously off stolen funds made my blood boil. This was about honoring my mother. About ensuring that her final act of courage wasn't in vain. I walked out of that chapel a different person than when I had entered. Grief still weighed heavily on my shoulders, but now it was joined by purpose. I had been the family outcast, the sensitive one, the one who didn't quite fit. Now I understood why. I was the only one with a conscience, the only one worthy of my mother's trust, and I was coming for them all. The family home stood silent as I pulled into the driveway. I knew I didn't have much time. My father had mentioned stopping by the house after the hospital, and I needed to find the safe before anyone else arrived. The key my mother had always kept hidden under a potted plant by the back door was still there, as if waiting for me. Inside, the house felt different, colder somehow, its warmth having departed with my mother. I moved quickly up the stairs to her bedroom, a space that had been exclusively hers for years. My father had moved to the guest room long ago, claiming my mother's restlessness disturbed his sleep. Now I wondered if it had been guilt, not insomnia, that had kept her awake at night. The painting of the lighthouse hung exactly where it always had, a serene coastal scene my mother had loved because it reminded her of childhood summers in Maine. I carefully removed it from the wall, revealing a small electronic safe I'd never known existed. With trembling fingers, I entered the combination: my birthday, just as she had said. The safe door swung open with a soft click. Inside was a treasure trove of evidence, exactly as Mom had promised. 3 USB drives labeled conversations, financial records, an investigation, a thick manila folder of documents, a small recorder, and a business card for someone named Amanda Prescott, attorney at law, with a handwritten note on the back: call immediately after. I gathered everything into my tote bag, knowing I needed to be thorough but quick. As I was about to close the safe, I noticed a small velvet jewelry box tucked in the back. Inside was my grandmother's sapphire necklace, a family heirloom I'd thought had been sold years ago when we hit what my father had called a rough patch. Another lie in a mountain of deception. Just as I secured the necklace in my bag, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. A glance out the window confirmed my fears: my father's Mercedes, with Uncle Bennett in the passenger seat. I quickly replaced the painting, made sure the room looked undisturbed, and slipped down the back stairs. I could hear their voices as they entered through the front door. We need to clear out her personal items as soon as possible, Bennett was saying. The real estate market is hot right now. We could list the house next week. Hazel will be a problem, my father replied, his voice cold and calculating in a way I'd never heard before. She'll want to keep everything for sentimental reasons. Richard, she's been unemployed for months taking care of Elaine. She needs money. Offer her a small cut to cooperate, and if that doesn't work. Their voices faded as they moved into the study, but the message was clear. They were already planning to sell my mother's home, our family home, mere hours after her death. This was betrayal number 4, and it stung just as sharply as the others. I crept toward the kitchen, planning my escape, when I nearly collided with a figure coming in the back door. I stifled a scream, then relaxed slightly when I recognized Linda Garrett, my mother's best friend of 20 years. "Hazel, you startled me," Linda whispered, noticing my finger to my lips. "I used my key, I hope that's okay. I wanted to bring by some food for the family." I motioned for her to follow me outside, away from my father and uncle's ears. "Linda," I said once we were safely by her car, "did Mom ever talk to you about financial concerns?" Linda's expression shifted, her typical warm smile replaced by something more guarded. "Let's not do this here," she said, looking toward the house. "Meet me at Riverside Cafe in 20 minutes. Over coffee in a quiet corner booth, Linda confirmed what my mother's letter had revealed. "Elaine started having suspicions about a year ago," she explained. "She found some documents Bennett had left out, statements for accounts she didn't recognize. When she started digging, things didn't add up." "Why didn't she go to the police?" I asked. "Evidence. She needed concrete proof, not just suspicions. And she was afraid for you, Hazel. She knew your father could be vindictive, and if he felt cornered." Linda trailed off, then reached across the table to squeeze my hand. She was building a case, collecting information. "She made me promise not to tell you until she was ready, or until she was gone," I finished. Linda nodded sadly. The cancer diagnosis changed her timeline. She was so angry, Hazel, not just about the money, but about the lost time. 3 decades married to a man who saw her as nothing but a bank account. "And my siblings?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Tyler found out in college when your father brought him into the family business. Morgan discovered it later but was happy to take her share. Your mother was heartbroken, but not surprised." I guessed. "No," Linda agreed. "Not surprised about them, but she was always so proud of you, Hazel. She said you were the only one who inherited her heart, not just her money." As Linda and I talked, I realized she could be a valuable ally, someone who knew the family dynamics, and could corroborate my mother's state of mind if the case went to court. Before we parted, she gave me additional context about my mother's suspicions and the steps she had taken to document the fraud. Back in my apartment that evening, I created multiple copies of all the evidence, storing backups in various secure locations. I couldn't risk losing this information if my family discovered what I knew. As I reviewed the financial documents, the scale of the theft became clear. Nearly $12 million had been siphoned from my mother's inheritance over the years, moved through a complex web of accounts and investments designed to conceal the fraud. The most recent transfers had occurred just months ago, right around the time of Mom's diagnosis. They had used her illness as cover to accelerate their theft, knowing she was too sick to fight back. The recorded conversations were even more damning. My mother, always thoughtful, had secretly recorded discussions with my father, in which he openly admitted to creative accounting with her inheritance. There was even a recording of Tyler laughing about how clueless Mom had been about the money Bennett was redistributing. As I sat surrounded by evidence of my family's betrayal, my phone buzzed with a text from Morgan. "Dad wants to meet with all of us at the house tomorrow to discuss Mom's things, 10 a.m. I stared at the message, thinking about how just days ago, I would have read it at face value, a family coming together to mourn and remember. Now I saw the predators behind the pretense. They were circling, ready to divide the spoils of their decades-long deception, but they had no idea what was coming for them. I sent a simple reply, "I'll be there," and then called the number on Amanda Prescott's card. It was time to fight back. Calvin Miller's law office was housed in a stately brick building in downtown Boston, the kind of place that exuded old money and discretion. At precisely 10 a.m., I found myself seated at a polished conference table beside my father, uncle, brother, and sister. Calvin, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual expression of mild discomfort, sat at the head of the table with my mother's will before him. "Before we begin," Calvin said, clearing his throat, "I want to express my condolences to the Reed family. Elaine was a remarkable woman." My father nodded impatiently. Yes. Thank you, Calvin. "Shall we proceed?" I studied my family members' faces. My father and Uncle Bennett wore identical expressions of solemn authority, the mask of grieving family members barely concealing their eagerness. Tyler kept checking his watch, clearly annoyed at having to sit through this formality. Morgan dabbed at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, putting on a show of grief I now knew was entirely fabricated. Calvin adjusted his glasses and began reading the will. Most of it was standard legal language, but then came the surprises. To my daughter, Hazel Reed, I leave the family home at 247 Maple Street, including all furnishings and personal items contained therein. What? My father interrupted, his facade of grief instantly dissolving. That's not possible, Calvin continued, as if he hadn't heard. Additionally, I leave to Hazel my personal jewelry collection, including all family heirlooms, my art collection, and the sum of $50,000 from my personal account at First National Bank. My father's face reddened. This is ridiculous. Elaine didn't have a personal account. All our finances were joint. Calvin looked uncomfortable but pressed on. To my husband, Richard Reed, I leave my collection of books and the memory of our life together. The silence that followed was deafening. My father stood up, looming over Calvin. This is preposterous. What about the investment accounts? The property in the Berkshires? The stock portfolio? Calvin cleared his throat again. According to the will, those assets are controlled by the existing financial arrangements between you and Mrs. Reed. Damn right they are. Bennett interjected, exchanging a triumphant look with my father. Morgan turned to me, her expression a mixture of confusion and anger. Why would Mom leave you the house? You don't even live there anymore. Maybe because I was the one who was actually there for her, I replied evenly. Tyler snorted. Oh, here we go with the martyr routine. You quit your job to play nurse because you didn't have anything better going on. Don't act like it was some noble sacrifice. I bit back a sharper retort, remembering Amanda Prescott's advice from our call the previous night. Let them think they've won. The element of surprise is our greatest advantage. My father, recovering his composure, adopted a more conciliatory tone. Hazel, be reasonable. The house is far too large for one person, and the property taxes alone will eat through that $50,000 in no time. Why don't we sell it and split the proceeds? You could use that money to restart your career. I recognized the strategy, the carrot after the stick. When bullying failed, try bribery. I'd like some time to think about it, I said, forcing vulnerability into my voice. Mom just died yesterday. This is all happening so fast. Bennett leaned forward, his smile not reaching his eyes. Of course you need time, Hazel. We all do. But the real estate market won't wait, and there are carrying costs to consider. That was when Uncle Bennett revealed the fifth betrayal, the one that confirmed every suspicion. Besides, he continued, lowering his voice as if sharing a confidence, there may be some irregularities in the will. Elaine's mental state in her final months was questionable at best. The medication, the pain it affects decision-making. We might need to contest this will on the grounds of diminished capacity. They were planning to invalidate my mother's final wishes by claiming she was incompetent, the same woman who had meticulously gathered evidence of their fraud while fighting terminal cancer. I felt a surge of rage so powerful it took every ounce of self-control not to confront them with what I knew. Instead, I channeled that anger into a performance of my own. Contest the will, I asked, letting my voice waver. Is that really necessary? I'm sure we can work something out as a family. That's my girl. My father said with patronizing approval. Well, take care of everything. You don't need to worry about the complicated stuff. As the meeting concluded, I gathered my copy of the will, still playing the role of the overwhelmed, compliant daughter. But as I was leaving, I couldn't resist one small hint that I wasn't as naive as they believed. It's strange, I said, pausing at the door. Mom mentioned something about accounts I didn't know about. Something about a Montgomery inheritance? Did any of you know about that? The effect was immediate and telling. My father's face drained of color. Bennett's hand froze mid-air. Tyler and Morgan exchanged quick, panicked glances. Your mother was confused, my father said too quickly. There was no Montgomery money. Just another delusion from the medication. I nodded as if accepting this explanation. You're probably right. I'm sure if there was some huge inheritance, my own father wouldn't have hidden it from me for 30 years. With that parting shot just subtle enough to unnerve but not explicit enough to reveal my hand, I left the office. As I waited for the elevator, Calvin Miller hurried after me, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one from my family had followed. Hazel, he said in a low voice, pressing a business card into my hand. Call me on my personal number. There are things about your mother's estate I couldn't say in there. I looked at him, surprised. You know, don't you?" His expression was answer enough. "I've been your family's lawyer for 20 years. I've seen patterns, documents that didn't quite add up. But I never had proof, and your mother swore me to secrecy." "Why are you helping me now?" I asked. "Because Elaine was one of the finest people I've ever known," he said simply. "And what they've done to her, what they're still doing, isn't right." As the elevator doors opened, I realized I had just gained a second unexpected ally, someone on the inside of my family's financial dealings. The confrontation had been difficult, but it had confirmed the truth of my mother's letter and given me valuable insights into my family's plans. They thought they had intimidated me into submission. They believed I would buckle under pressure, just as I always had. But they had no idea that the quiet, compliant Hazel was gone. In her place stood her mother's daughter, a woman prepared to fight with everything she had. As I drove away from Calvin's office, I received a text from Tyler. "Just take the money and keep your mouth shut. Trust me, you don't want to make enemies of Dad and Bennett." It was meant as a threat, but I took it as confirmation. They were worried, and they should be. Amanda Prescott's office couldn't have been more different from Calvin Miller's. Where his was all mahogany and tradition, hers was modern, bright, and located in a converted warehouse space in Cambridge. Amanda herself defied my expectations, a woman in her early 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor and bright blue hair that somehow didn't diminish her obvious professionalism. "Your mother contacted me 4 months ago," she explained as we sat in her glass-walled conference room. "She was extraordinarily thorough in her documentation. She always was meticulous," I said, feeling a fresh wave of grief at this new evidence of my mother's foresight and courage. Even while dying, she was thinking 10 steps ahead. "That meticulousness is what will win this case," Amanda said, spreading out the documents I had brought from the safe. "This is one of the most comprehensive fraud files I've ever seen." The private investigator she hired was top-notch. Over the next 2 hours, Amanda laid out our legal strategy. We would file for an emergency injunction to freeze all assets connected to my mother's original inheritance, while we prepared a civil case against my father and uncle for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Simultaneously, we would provide evidence to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. "What about my siblings?" I asked. "The evidence shows they were receiving payouts from these accounts." Amanda didn't sugarcoat it. "They're complicit. Whether they face criminal charges depends on the DA, but civilly, they'll be named as co-defendants." The prospect of taking legal action against my entire family was daunting, but the evidence of their betrayal was too substantial to ignore. I thought of my mother fighting this battle alone for months, knowing the truth but protecting me until she could no longer do so. "I want to use my accounting background to help," I told Amanda. "I understand financial forensics. I can trace where the money went." Amanda smiled for the first time. "Your mother said you would say that. She was very proud of your financial acumen. Said it was the reason they could never fully pull the wool over your eyes." With that validation of my mother's faith in me, I threw myself into the investigation. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked nearly around the clock, using my accounting skills to follow the complex money trail my father and uncle had created. What I uncovered was staggering. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. The shell companies used to launder funds. The fraudulent investment losses reported to my mother while the actual profits were diverted elsewhere. The properties purchased with her money but titled under Bennett's holding company. The total amount stolen over 3 decades came to just over $14 million, even more than my mother had estimated. During this time, my family made multiple attempts to contact me. My father left voicemails that evolved from conciliatory, "Hazel, let's discuss the house situation like adults," to threatening, "You're making a very big mistake ignoring my calls." Morgan sent texts alternating between sisterly concern and thinly veiled accusations that I was tearing the family apart during our time of grief. I maintained minimal contact, making excuses about needing time alone to process our mother's death. But I was running out of time to play this charade. Then came the 6th betrayal, more personal than the others. I was at my mother's house, carefully documenting her belongings for the case, when Morgan unexpectedly showed up. She seemed genuinely emotional, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I had misjudged her involvement. "I miss her too, you know," she said, eyes welling with tears as she looked at our mother's collection of antique teacups. "Despite what you probably think, I loved Mom." "I know you did, in your way," I said cautiously. Morgan sat on the edge of the bed, running her hand over our mother's quilt. "Hazel, there's something I need to tell you." something I've suspected for a while but never had the courage to say. My heart raced. Was she about to confess? To confirm what I already knew? Mom wasn't well, mentally, toward the end, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She had these paranoid delusions about Dad stealing from her. She told me wild stories about hidden millions and offshore accounts. I fought to keep my expression neutral as I realized what she was doing. This wasn't a confession, it was groundwork for the diminished capacity claim Bennett had mentioned. She never mentioned anything like that to me. I lied, watching her carefully. She made me promise not to tell anyone. Morgan continued, the performance impressive in its sincerity. But now that she's gone, I'm worried about you being alone in this house with all these memories. Maybe Dad's right about selling it. He'll think about it, I said non-committally. Morgan hugged me before leaving, and I let her, my skin crawling at the contact. What I didn't know was that her visit had a dual purpose. 2 days later, when I returned to my apartment, I found it had been broken into. Nothing valuable was taken, not my laptop or jewelry, but my tote bag, which had held some of the documents from my mother's safe, was emptied. Thankfully, I had already made copies of everything and stored the originals in a safe deposit box, following Amanda's advice. The only person who knew I had those documents was Morgan, the sister who had hugged me while planning to steal the evidence that would incriminate her. I reported the break-in to the police and to Amanda, who immediately accelerated our timeline. They know you have something, she said. We need to file the injunction now, before they can move any more assets. The following day, I received a notification that my bank accounts had been frozen due to suspected fraudulent activity. When I called the bank, they informed me that someone claiming to be me had reported my cards stolen. It took hours of verification and a visit to the branch manager to resolve the issue. My family was trying to cut off my financial resources to make me desperate enough to accept whatever settlement they offered for the house. It was a transparent tactic, but effective. I was running low on savings after months of caring for my mother without income. Then came an unexpected lifeline. Calvin Miller called, asking to meet urgently at a coffee shop far from his office. Your father is planning to contest the will, he told me, sliding a folder across the table. Hes claiming your mother was mentally incompetent due to pain medication when she signed it. Can he do that? I asked. He can try, but he won't succeed, Calvin said with quiet confidence. Because I have this. The folder contained a video recording of my mother signing her will 3 months before her death, clearly lucid and explicitly stating her reasons for her decisions. More damning, it included footage of my father and Bennett discussing how to handle Hazel if she became difficult about the assets. Why are you giving me this? I asked Calvin. You're still technically their lawyer. I'm the family's lawyer, he corrected. And your mother was part of that family. What they're doing violates not just the law, but everything I believe about justice. I can't be part of it anymore. With Calvin's evidence added to our case, Amanda felt we were ready to file the injunction. But the night before our court date, I faced my lowest moment yet. A small electrical fire broke out in my apartment building, specifically near the circuit breaker closest to my unit. The fire department determined it had been deliberately set. Nothing was damaged except the electrical system, but the message was clear. This was a warning. That night, sitting in a hotel room, paid for by my dwindling savings, I nearly gave up. The stress, the fear, the constant vigilance, it was taking a toll. For a moment, I considered taking the settlement they would surely offer, walking away from the fight my mother had entrusted to me. Then my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. Is this Hazel Reed? A woman's voice asked when I answered. Yes, I said cautiously. My name is Rebecca Winters. I was your father's business partner about 15 years ago. I understand you're looking into some financial irregularities involving the Montgomery inheritance. My heart raced. How did you know about that? Because your mother contacted me 6 months ago with the same questions. I've been gathering documentation ever since. I think it's time we talked. In that moment, I realized my mother had cast a wider net than I'd imagined. She had created a support system for me, allies who would emerge when I needed them most. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was ours. Rebecca became our third ally and the most powerful one yet. As my father's former partner, she had witnessed the early stages of the fraud and kept records out of her own suspicion. She had emails, transaction histories, even recorded conversations that directly implicated my father and uncle in the systematic theft of my mother's inheritance. Armed with this new evidence, I found my resolve again. The next morning, I walked into the courthouse with Amanda Prescott beside me, ready to take the first public step in exposing my family's crimes. What I didn't know then was that my father had anticipated this move. He was already there, with his legal team, prepared for a battle that would test every ounce of my strength and determination. The temporary injunction hearing should have been straightforward given our evidence, but my father's legal team came prepared with a devastating counterattack. They presented sworn statements from Tyler, Morgan, and 3 of my mother's doctors claiming she had experienced paranoid delusions in her final months. They had medical records showing the high doses of pain medication she had been prescribed, and testimony from a psychiatrist who had never actually treated my mother but was willing to state that such medications could cause paranoia and confusion. Judge Peterson granted our injunction, but it was narrower than we had hoped, freezing only the specific accounts mentioned in my mother's documentation, leaving several others we had identified through our investigation untouched. It's still a win, Amanda assured me as we left the courthouse. We've stopped them from liquidating the main assets while we build the larger case. But my family was not content to fight this battle only in the courts. Within days of the hearing, they launched a comprehensive smear campaign against me. It started with concerned calls from family friends asking if I was doing okay. Then came the whispers that reached me through Linda and other sympathetic connections, rumors that I had neglected my mother during her illness, that I had manipulated her into changing her will, that I had even accelerated her death by withholding proper care. My father gave a heart-wrenching interview to a local newspaper about his concerns for his troubled daughter, who had unfortunately developed an unhealthy obsession during the trauma of her mother's illness. He was quoted as saying, "We just want to help Hazel get the support she needs during this difficult time." The narrative they constructed was both cunning and cruel. I wasn't a daughter seeking justice, but a mentally unstable woman driven by grief and jealousy to attack her mourning family. Former colleagues called to tell me they had received concerned inquiries about my mental health and work ethic. My landlord mentioned that someone had contacted him about erratic behavior in my apartment. Even my few close friends began to distance themselves, uncertain what to believe about the increasingly bizarre accusations. The isolation was strategic and effective. Cut off from my support system, struggling financially, and constantly looking over my shoulder, I was exactly where my family wanted me, vulnerable and alone. Then came the 7th betrayal, more direct than the psychological warfare. I returned to my apartment one evening to find the door slightly ajar. Inside, everything appeared untouched at first glance, but my instincts told me someone had been there. A quick inventory confirmed my suspicions. My laptop was in a slightly different position. Papers on my desk had been moved, and the hiding place where I kept a backup USB drive of evidence was empty. I called Amanda immediately. Then the police. While waiting for them to arrive, I received a text from an unknown number. "Looking for something, sis? Maybe we should talk about a settlement before things get worse." It was Tyler. He hadn't even bothered to hide his identity in the break-in. He wanted me to know it was him, to feel violated and frightened. The police took a report, but without signs of forced entry or significant theft. They classified it as a low-priority case. That night, I stayed at Linda's house, too shaken to return to my apartment. The next morning brought the most frightening escalation, yet a small fire had broken out in my apartment building, specifically near my unit. The fire department contained it quickly, and no one was injured, but the message was clear. The threats were escalating from psychological to physical. "We need to consider your safety," Amanda said when I called her with the news. "These are not people who will stop at intimidation." I thought of my mother, fighting cancer while also fighting the family who should have been supporting her. If she could face that double battle with courage, how could I do any less? "I'm not backing down," I told Amanda. "But I need a safer place to stay and work." Amanda arranged for me to move temporarily into a secure apartment building owned by a client of hers. I told no one except Linda where I was staying, and I varied my routes to Amanda's office for our meetings. From this new base of operations, I launched my own counter-strategy. Rebecca Winters had provided me with contact information for several former employees of my father's who had witnessed questionable financial practices. I reached out to each of them, building a network of potential witnesses for our case. I also began documenting everything about my mother's final months, her lucidity, her careful planning, her consistent behavior. I created a detailed timeline with photographs, videos I had taken during our time together, and notes from her medical appointments that I had attended. This would be our defense against the claims that she had been delusional or incompetent. Linda contributed her own documentation, text messages, emails, and photos showing my consistent presence at my mother's side while my family was conspicuously absent. She had even kept a visitor log at my mother's request, noting who came to see her and for how long during her final weeks. Most powerfully, I had my mother's own voice. During her last months, knowing she might not live to testify, she had recorded video statements detailing the discovery of the fraud, her mental clarity despite her illness, and her explicit wishes regarding her estate. These recordings, made on days when she was not heavily medicated, showed a woman who was frail in body, but sharp in mind, articulate, detailed, and absolutely certain of what she had uncovered. While building this evidence, I also used my accounting expertise to continue tracing the money trail. Following Rebecca's guidance, I discovered offshore accounts I hadn't known about previously, including one opened just 2 weeks after my mother's diagnosis. The timing confirmed what I had long suspected. They had seen her illness not as a family tragedy but as a financial opportunity, a chance to complete the theft they had begun decades ago. My family, realizing their initial attacks hadn't deterred me, escalated further. Morgan created a concerned family Facebook page sharing carefully edited video clips of me looking tired and stressed during my mother's illness, suggesting I had been mentally unraveling. Tyler gave interviews to local media, portraying himself as the loving son trying to protect his mother's legacy from his sister's delusions. The most painful blow came when they hired a private investigator who approached my mother's nurses and doctors, seeking statements that I had been controlling or manipulative during her care. Some refused to speak with him, but others, perhaps intimidated or simply confused by the situation, gave statements that were later twisted to suggest I had isolated my mother from proper medical care. I nearly broke under this eighth betrayal, the weaponization of my mother's illness against me, the perversion of my care for her into something sinister. For the first time since finding my mother's letter, I considered giving up the fight. That night, alone in my temporary apartment, I pulled out my mother's letter and reread her words. "You have always seen more clearly than the others. Felt more deeply. That wasn't weakness, as your father claimed, it was integrity." She had trusted me with this fight because she knew I would not abandon it, no matter how difficult it became. I couldn't let her down now. The next morning, I called Amanda with a new plan, one that would turn my family's tactics against them. "They're trying to control the narrative," I explained. "So let's change it." With Amanda's guidance, I created a simple website documenting my mother's journey through cancer, featuring photos and short videos of our time together, her clear cognitive function, and most devastatingly, the empty hospital room during her final days. When my family was notably absent, I didn't make accusations or mention the legal case. I simply presented the reality of those months, a daughter caring for her dying mother while the rest of the family was nowhere to be seen. The contrast between their current public concern and their actual behavior spoke volumes. The website went live just as my family was escalating their public relations campaign. The timing couldn't have been better. Journalists who had been fed my family's version of events now had access to a very different perspective, one backed by time-stamped photos and videos. The tide of public opinion began to shift, and with it, my family's strategy. My father attempted to have the website taken down with legal threats, but Amanda had ensured everything was factually accurate and legally defensible. Then came a development I hadn't expected. Calvin Miller contacted me with news that my father had instructed him to approach me about a settlement. "Hess offering $1 million, Calvin said, "in exchange for your dropping all claims and signing an NDA. It was the first acknowledgement, however indirect, that there was merit to my case. $1 million, a fraction of what they had stolen, but more money than I had ever had at my disposal. Tell him, I'll consider it," I replied, following Amanda's guidance to keep all channels open. The offer was a sign of weakness, and we intended to exploit it. What we didn't know was that my family had one final card to play, one that would nearly cost me everything. The settlement offer was a turning point, the first crack in my family's unified front. Amanda and I knew it was just the beginning of negotiations, not a serious attempt to resolve the case. We countered with a demand for full financial transparency and significantly more compensation. As expected, my father rejected our counteroffer, but the dialogue had been established. Over the next 2 weeks, offers and counteroffers flew back and forth through intermediaries, each exchange revealing more about my family's concerns and priorities. "They're especially anxious about the recordings," Amanda observed after one particularly heated negotiation session. "Your father's team practically turned white when we mentioned your mother's video testimony. This insight gave us leverage for our most audacious move yet, a sting operation designed to catch my father and uncle in a damning admission. The plan was complex and risky, requiring perfect timing and the cooperation of our growing team of allies. Rebecca Winters would reach out to Bennett, claiming to have discovered documentation from their old business dealings that could be problematic in the current legal battle. She would suggest a meeting to discuss mutual interests in keeping certain transactions private. The meeting would take place at a hotel conference room, secretly recorded with equipment provided by Amanda's private investigator. Rebecca would be wearing a wire, with Calvin Miller unexpectedly joining halfway through to add credibility and pressure. "Are you sure this is legal?" I asked Amanda, as we finalized the details. "Massachusetts is a two-party consent state for recordings," she acknowledged. "But we're not planning to use this as court evidence. It's leverage for settlement, and to convince the DA to pursue criminal charges." The day of the meeting arrived with nerve-wracking intensity. I watched via closed-circuit camera from an adjacent room, as Rebecca greeted my uncle with practiced casualness. Bennett, always the more financially focused of the brothers, had agreed to meet without my father exactly as we had hoped. "I've been following the situation with Elaine's estate," Rebecca began after pleasantries were exchanged. "Quite a mess Richard has gotten himself into." Bennett's posture stiffened. "Family disagreements can get complicated. Grief affects people differently." "Indeed," Rebecca said with calculated ambiguity. "But some complications predate the grief, don't they, Bennett? Like that Cayman account we set up in 2003. The look on Bennett's face was worth every moment of stress leading up to this meeting. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his expression betrayed him. "Don't insult my intelligence," Rebecca replied coolly. "I kept records of everything. The question is, what are those records worth to you, now that Hazel is building a case?" Bennett leaned forward, voice lowered. "What exactly do you want, Rebecca?" "Financial security," she said simply. "The same thing you and Richard have been extracting from Elaine's inheritance for decades." Bennett's eyes narrowed, calculating risk versus reward. "Hypothetically," he began, choosing his words carefully, "if someone had restructured certain assets for tax advantages, that would be entirely legal with proper authorization." "And did you have proper authorization when you forged Elaine's signature on the Berkshire property transfer?" Rebecca asked innocently. Before Bennett could answer, there was a knock at the door. Calvin Miller entered, apologizing for his lateness with a performance worthy of an Oscar. "Calvin." Bennett's surprise quickly morphed into suspicion. "What are you doing here?" "Rebecca called me," Calvin said smoothly. "She thought I might have relevant insights, given my long history with the Reed family finances." The trap was set. Calvin's presence, as the family's trusted legal advisor, created an illusion of confidentiality that loosened Bennett's tongue. Over the next hour, believing he was in a strategy session to contain potential damage, Bennett made a series of devastating admissions. He acknowledged the creative management of Elaine's inheritance, defended the necessary deception given her financial naivete, and even admitted that my father had orchestrated the exclusion of my mother from key investment decisions. Most damning of all, when Calvin carefully asked about my mother's mental state during her illness, Bennett scoffed. Elaine was sharp as a tack until the very end. That's why Richard was so worried she was asking too many questions, looking at old statements. The cancer was actually a blessing in that way, gave her something else to focus on. I felt physically ill hearing my mother's suffering described as a blessing for their fraud, but I forced myself to keep watching. We needed this evidence. As the meeting concluded, Bennett seemed satisfied with what he believed was a potential alliance against me. He even suggested bringing my father into the loop to coordinate our approach to Hazel's unfortunate delusions. Once Bennett had left, Rebecca and Calvin joined me and Amanda in the adjacent room, all of us processing the success of our sting. "We got him," Amanda said, reviewing the recording. "This isn't just leverage for a civil settlement anymore. This is criminal evidence." The next day, armed with the recording and our comprehensive evidence file, Amanda and I met with Assistant District Attorney James Martinez. After reviewing our materials for over 2 hours, Martinez looked up with an expression that gave me my first real hope. "Miss Reed," he said gravely, "I believe we have sufficient evidence to open a criminal investigation for wire fraud, tax evasion, and elder financial abuse." Within 48 hours, my father and uncle received formal notices that they were under criminal investigation. Simultaneously, Amanda filed an expanded civil suit, naming not just my father and uncle, but also Tyler and Morgan as co-defendants, citing their knowledge of and benefit from the fraudulent scheme. the family united front shattered. Morgan's lawyer reached out first, suggesting she might be willing to testify against my father and uncle in exchange for immunity. Tyler, always following the path of least resistance, quickly made a similar overture. My father, realizing the walls were closing in, made one final desperate move. Through his attorney, he offered a settlement of $8 million, still far less than what had been stolen, but a substantial concession. "What do you want to do?" Amanda asked me when the offer came in. "We can push for more, but litigation could take years, and criminal proceedings are never guaranteed." I thought about what my mother would want. She had sought justice, yes, but also closure, a chance for me to move forward, without the shadow of this betrayal hanging over me. Counter at 12 million. I decided. Non-negotiable, and I want a full confession and apology, in writing, acknowledging everything they did to my mother. My father balked at the confession requirement, but with the criminal investigation advancing and his own children preparing to testify against him, he ultimately had no choice. 2 days later, his attorney delivered a signed settlement agreement along with a notarized letter acknowledging the decades of financial abuse. The letter was clinical and clearly written by attorneys, but it contained the truth, a validation of everything my mother had discovered and fought to expose. Reading it, I felt a complex mixture of vindication, grief, and finally, a sense of completion. My mother's battle was over. She had won. The criminal investigation continued despite our civil settlement, with my father and uncle ultimately accepting a plea deal that included substantial fines, 5 years of probation, and for my father, a 6-month house arrest sentence. Their professional licenses were revoked, and the financial industry they had manipulated for so long closed its doors to them permanently. Tyler and Morgan avoided criminal charges by cooperating with prosecutors, but our relationship was irreparably damaged. The siblings who had abandoned our mother and participated in the theft of her inheritance were now strangers to me, people I might pass on the street without acknowledgement. As for me, I found myself in possession of a restored inheritance, and the daunting task of rebuilding a life that had been derailed by grief, betrayal, and a year-long legal battle. The house where I had grown up, the home my mother had ensured would remain mine, became both sanctuary and burden, filled with memories both painful and precious. After much reflection, I decided to sell it, using part of the proceeds to establish the Elaine Montgomery Reed Foundation for Cancer Patient Advocacy, ensuring that others facing terminal illness would have the support my mother had been denied. 6 months after the settlement, I stood at my mother's grave with a bouquet of her favorite peonies. The headstone had recently been updated with the Montgomery family crest, acknowledging the heritage that had been denied to her in life. "We did it, Mom," I said quietly, placing the flowers beside the marble marker. "You trusted me with your truth, and I didn't let you down." In the distance, I could see Linda waiting respectfully by the cemetery gate, giving me privacy for this moment. She had remained a steadfast ally throughout the ordeal, a connection to my mother that I cherished more than ever. As I turned to leave, a cardinal landed on a nearby branch, brilliant red against the green foliage, just like the one my mother and I had watched from her hospital window on her final morning. In that moment, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me since finding her letter. Justice had been served, not perfectly, but substantially. The truth had been acknowledged. And in fighting for my mother's legacy, I had discovered strengths within myself I never knew existed. The path ahead would not be easy. Trust and connection would always be complicated for me after such profound betrayal. But I was my mother's daughter, with her resilience, her clarity, and her capacity for joy despite life's hardships. That was the true inheritance she had left me, far more valuable than any fortune. 6 months after the settlement, I sat in the sunlit office of the newly established Elaine Montgomery Reed Foundation for Cancer Patient Advocacy. The organization, funded with $4 million from my recovered inheritance, had already helped dozens of patients navigate the complex medical, legal, and financial challenges that come with a cancer diagnosis. The foundation had become my purpose, a way to transform my mother's suffering and my own pain into something meaningful. We provided grants for patients who needed to take time off work during treatment, legal assistance for those dealing with insurance denials, and advocates who would sit with patients during appointments to ensure their voices were heard. Every success story felt like a tribute to my mother. "The Johnson family called," said Melissa, the foundation's program director, poking her head into my office. "Mr. Johnson's treatment is working, and they wanted to thank you personally for the housing assistance that let them stay close to the hospital." I smiled, feeling the familiar mixture of happiness and grief that accompanied these moments. That's wonderful news. Make sure we follow up next month to see if they need anything else. After Melissa left, I opened my desk drawer and took out the small velvet box containing my grandmother's sapphire necklace, the family heirloom I had found in my mother's safe. I wore it to every board meeting, a tangible connection to the Montgomery legacy that had been denied to my mother for so long. The legal aftermath of my family's crimes continued to unfold, even as I worked to build something positive from the ashes. My father and uncle had both received their sentences, my father serving 6 months of house arrest followed by 5 years of probation, while Uncle Bennett had avoided incarceration, but received a steeper financial penalty and longer probation term due to his role as financial advisor. The professional consequences had been even more severe. Both were permanently barred from working in financial services, their licenses revoked, their reputations destroyed. My father's once thriving practice had been dissolved, with clients fleeing en masse once the details of the fraud became public. Tyler and Morgan had escaped criminal charges through their cooperation, but the civil settlement had required them to repay substantial amounts from the stolen funds they had received over the years. Tyler had been forced to sell his luxury condo and move to a much more modest apartment. Morgan's lavish lifestyle had similarly contracted, her social media presence notably subdued from its former showcasing of expensive vacations and designer purchases. I had no contact with any of them anymore, a complete severing of family ties that was both painful and necessary. Occasionally I would hear updates through Linda or other connections, but I maintained my distance, focused on healing and rebuilding rather than revenge or resentment. The healing process had not been linear. After the initial victory of the settlement, I had crashed hard, the adrenaline of the fight suddenly gone, leaving me face to face with grief that had been postponed but not processed. The loss of my mother, compounded by the traumatic unraveling of my family, left wounds that couldn't be healed simply by winning a legal battle. On the recommendation of Amanda, who had become a friend as well as my attorney, I began seeing Dr. Simmons, a therapist specializing in grief and family trauma. Our weekly sessions became a crucial part of my recovery, a safe space to untangle the complex emotions surrounding my mother's death and my family's betrayal. Grief isn't just about losing your mother, Dr. Simmons had explained in one of our early sessions. You've also lost your entire family structure and the narrative of your childhood. Everything you thought you knew has been rewritten. That reframing had been powerful permission to mourn not just my mother, but also the family I thought I had, the childhood memories now tainted by the knowledge of the deception running beneath them. Slowly, I began to rebuild a life with authentic connections. Linda remained a cornerstone, a link to my mother, and a model of genuine friendship. Calvin Miller and I maintained a warm professional relationship, his integrity during the case earning my lasting respect. Rebecca Winters became a mentor of sorts, her business acumen and resilience inspiring my own professional reinvention. And there were new relationships too. Through the foundation, I met people who shared my commitment to patient advocacy: doctors, lawyers, social workers, and other family members who had walked similar paths. Among them was Dr. Michael Brennan, an oncologist whose compassionate approach to patient care had made him one of our most valuable medical advisors. Our professional relationship had gradually evolved into something more personal, a slow-building connection based on mutual respect and shared values. Michael had lost his own father to cancer years earlier, and he understood the complex grief that came with watching a parent suffer through terminal illness. Unlike my previous relationships, which had often been undermined by my family's subtle disapproval, this one developed on solid ground, nurtured by honesty and patience. "What are you thinking about?" Michael asked one evening as we walked along the Charles River after a foundation fundraiser. "You've got that faraway look again." "Just reflecting on how much has changed in a year," I admitted. "Sometimes it feels like I'm living someone else's life." "Is that good or bad?" he asked, his psychiatrist's instinct for the right question showing through. I considered for a moment. Both. I miss her every day, and sometimes I still can't believe what they did, how thoroughly they betrayed her. But I'm also proud of what we've built with the foundation. I think she would be too. Michael nodded, understanding the duality of my experience without trying to simplify it. That was one of the things I valued most about him: his comfort with complexity, his patience with the messy reality of healing. The foundation had recently expanded its programs to include specialized support for children of cancer patients, recognizing the unique challenges they faced. We had also begun advocating for policy changes to better protect vulnerable patients from financial exploitation during illness, a direct response to what had happened to my mother. The work was challenging but deeply fulfilling, a way to honor my mother's courage while creating something positive from our shared trauma. Each patient we helped felt like a small victory against the darkness that had threatened to consume me after her death. On the 1-year anniversary of finding my mother's letter, I visited her grave alone, bringing her favorite peonies, and taking time to tell her about the Foundation's work, about the lives we were touching in her name. "Your letter changed everything, Mom," I said softly to the quiet cemetery air. "Not just because it exposed their crimes, but because it showed me your courage. You fought so hard, even when you were suffering, even when you knew you might not see justice yourself. You trusted me to finish what you started." A gentle breeze rustled the flowers I had placed, and I felt a sense of peace that had been elusive during the tumultuous year of legal battles and emotional reckonings. My mother's secret letter had indeed changed everything, revealing not just decades of betrayal, but also the strength of a mother's love and foresight. In her final act of protection, she had armed me with truth and evidence, ensuring I wouldn't remain vulnerable to the family that had exploited her for so long. The inheritance I had reclaimed wasn't just financial. It was my mother's resilience, her integrity, her ability to face painful truths without being destroyed by them. Those qualities had carried me through the darkest days and would continue to guide me forward. As I stood to leave, I noticed a small cardinal watching from a nearby tree, brilliant red against the green leaves, just like the one my mother and I had watched from her hospital window on her final morning. In that moment, I felt her presence more strongly than I had since her death, not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but as the enduring impact of her love and courage on my life. "Thank you," I whispered, to my mother and to whatever force had allowed me to find justice for her, for giving me the truth, even when it was painful. It truly did set me free. If you've ever discovered a painful family secret or stood up for what's right even when it cost you relationships, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Have you ever had to fight for justice for someone you love? How did you find healing afterward? Please like this video if Hazel's journey resonated with you. Subscribe for more real-life stories of courage and resilience, and share this with someone who might need to hear that standing up for the truth is always worth it, even when it's difficult. Thank you for listening to my story. May you always have the strength to fight for what's right, and the wisdom to find peace when the battle is over.